This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts the show as he discusses more changes. This week he talks about car loan interest deduction, heifer bonus depreciation, and depreciation recapture. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth keeps the show rolling as he highlights the winter curl mite and why wheat growers might be seeing their wheat look silver. Ending the show is the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with special guest Dave Maples from the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association as they converse about beef being included when thinking about food as medicine. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Roger, talking through a few different topics that could impact farmers and ranchers and their operations. And first, starting with a car loan interest deduction, and what is that?
Well, it's a new provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and it allows us to deduct for vehicles that are new, acquired after 2024, and it's only good for the next 4 years, 25, 26, 27, and 28. We've got a new code section that allows the deduction of up to $10,000 of interest on a personal vehicle, on a vehicle that's purchased for personal uses, as long as it's a qualified vehicle. So major points on that. A lot of vehicles are qualified, has to have at least two wheels under 14,000 pounds. It can be an SUV, a pickup truck. It can be an automobile. It can be a motorcycle. It can't be a horse-drawn buggy because that doesn't have the qualified emission systems on it. I got that question when I was speaking in Pennsylvania earlier this year, and the answer is no. Now, the other problem with that is Amish don't borrow money, so not very likely that you're going to have deductible interest in that situation. But this is a big deal, and so it's a new one. Actually, we had this up until the '86 Tax Act, and then they removed the deduction for personal car loan interest, but now it's back.
And so this started after 2024. So is this something, as we're towards the end of 2025, if someone has bought something that would qualify, they can go back and use it?
Well, it's for tax years that begin after December 31, 2024. So it'll be available for loans taken out on new vehicles that qualify starting this year. So that means on the tax returns that will be prepared this coming tax season for purchases in 2025. Now, one other thing I didn't mention is the final assembly point must be in the United States. So you got to be careful on this. You need to, if you're going to buy a vehicle, you need to have the dealer run the VIN number so that you can verify that it was actually coming from an American final assembly plant, a place in the U.S. And an example on this, for example, you could have sitting on a lot two, for instance, Chevy Silverados that come to mind here because of the point I'm illustrating, that look exactly the same color, same bells and whistles. It's a brand new 25 model, has same options on it, identical truck. One of them is made at final assembly plant is Fort Wayne, Indiana truck plant, and the other one is Windsor, Ontario truck plant. Only the one that was finally assembled in Fort Wayne, Indiana would qualify. The other one would not qualify. So you have to be very careful in these situations to make sure that the final assembly point is in the United States.
Is this something then they just need to chat with their tax professional about to make sure it does get incorporated?
Well, at the purchase point, I would say this, to have the dealer verify, run that VIN number, and sometimes there's a label on a door jamb that will list final assembly point. But those are two ways to verify that. And then the tax preparer knows that interest would be deductible.
Roger, how might this be different than for if a farmer or rancher versus just a normal citizen might use?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, because if I'm a farmer and I buy a new pickup truck this year for my farm, There is a provision in the code, it's an existing provision, that if I'm using it 75% for business use, there's a safe harbor. And so if I want to use this new provision along with 75% business use, and so it's 25% personal, the way that interest gets allocated is 75% goes to the Schedule F. The remaining 25% of the interest is allowed as a deduction on the new Schedule 1A, which we already have a draft form of. So that's how it's going to be actually handled on the return.
Roger, while we're thinking about changes, is there a change when it comes to an encouragement to maybe help regrow the cattle herd?
Yeah, I think there is, and that's the restoration of 100% bonus depreciation for assets that are acquired and placed in service on or after January 20 of this year. And the way I see that is, of course, what's been happening in the beef herd is we're at historically small levels. And so there's been a lot of attention focused on beef prices recently. Well, it's a supply-demand issue largely. And the latest data indicates that beef replacement heifer inventory, so those female cattle that are being held back to become the future of the breeding herd, is at its lowest point on record, with overall cattle numbers hitting their smallest mid-year count since the 1970s. So you add that in with some other factors. Let's say you get persistent drought, you get high input costs. Now you're going to have a supply crunch. So what the restoration of 100% bonus does is it could be used to incentivize the purchase of breeding stock, because breeding stock is eligible to be bonused. It's also eligible for Section 179. But now, instead of having 40% bonus depreciation this year, you can take the whole thing. As long as that becomes a mature animal this year, then that's what the IRS says in terms of when a heifer is placed in service. It has to be mature, ready to be bred. And then you could claim 100% bonus on that. So you're front loading the depreciation. That'll reduce the taxable income for the livestock producer in the year of the purchase, which in turn would then reduce tax liability. And so that those tax savings would increase the cash flow of that livestock producer. And so when we put that in the context of herd growth, what I'm saying is that extra cash could be immediately reinvested into buying more replacement heifers and developing infrastructure or covering operating costs associated with retaining and managing a larger herd. So what I think this does is incentivize building the heifer herd faster than would otherwise happen without the OBBBA provision.
Do you think it's going to help?
Well, it's part of a whole decision-making process in terms of if I'm going to buy breeding heifers. It's a powerful financial tool, but herd growth is pretty complex. You've got biological and management challenges, and so you have to have an overall planning strategy. So your cull rate is key. The genetics, in terms of genetic selection, that's key. Reproductive efficiency, that's also important. So what is your calving window, and how do you maximize the number of calves per cow in a year? That's crucial too. So, but the thing that's nice on this is the bonus depreciation change is effective starting January 20 of this year. That's important, I think, with respect to heifers, because if I can get heifers bred early in the season, it increases the likelihood they'll rebreed the following year. So number of factors together, all I'm saying is this isn't going to hurt anything, and it could actually help build the heifer herd faster than otherwise would be the case.
And I'm sure you've been getting questions on this, and a recent question you have gotten involving depreciation recapture. And can you share with us the details of that question?
Yeah, this came in from a CPA. This was in Iowa, and they had inherited a client that had several hog confinement buildings purchased back in 2020, and one of those was purchased for $800,000, and they set it up as 10-year makers property for depreciation purposes, and they bonused it out. Now, at that time, bonus depreciation was 100%, so they deducted the full cost of that building in 2020, but that eliminates your income tax basis. That's kind of the trade-off here. You get all your depreciation in year one. You don't have anything left because you've lost your basis. Now, what he wants to do in 2025, the CPA that wrote me, said that the client wants to sell it this year. It still is worth $800,000, but he has no basis. And now the problem you run into on that, and the question specifically that he posed was, is the character of that gain what we call Section 1245 ordinary income recapture, even though it's real property, which would be under a different rule. Well, we've got a recharacterization rule in the code that says for single purpose ag structures, which is what this is, it does get recharacterized as 1245 ordinary gain on recapture. So the bottom line result for that hog producer is that he'll have $800,000 of ordinary income taxed at his ordinary income rates, not capital gain. And that's a big penalty. And so there's really no way out of that except for death. But he might have to rethink his strategy as to whether he wants to sell that building this year.
So what could have helped him avoid that?
Well, that's one of the things you have to realize when you do take bonus depreciation or even a large chunk of Section 179 depreciation. You have to drop your basis by the amount claimed. So if you dispose of that asset, you're going to trigger tax, and you're probably going to trigger tax at ordinary income rates, which could be bad. And so, again, this strategy of selling this hog confinement building has to be part of an overall strategy with other things that you're doing from a tax standpoint to make sure that you're not creating a major problem for yourself in that particular tax year. So that is, tax is complex, and you've got to consider a whole host of things, because if you, for example, push one button over here, this tax button may trigger 2 or 3 other tax buttons that we need to be managing at the same time. So try not to do things in isolation. Get good tax advice in advance to determine what's best overall.
If people want to read more on these topics, Roger, how can they do that?
These right now are posted to my Substack. That's McEowenAgLawandTax.substack.com. I'll probably spin some of these out at some point in time and post them to AgManager, but I don't have them there yet. Been on the road a lot. We're in the midst of tax schools now, but I'll eventually get to it.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with another pest update from K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure, anytime.
Jeff, you've been receiving questions about a few different pests, and beginning with winter grain mites, something we haven't recently talked about.
Yes, and thank goodness we haven't. It seems like we've talked about enough pests this year to last us for a while, but winter grain mites, anything in wheat right now, gets everybody's attention. And it would even more so as they get all the soybeans and sorghum and everything harvested, and they start paying a little more attention to the wheat. The problem with the winter grain mite is, as the name implies, they are out and about during the winter or during the fall and the spring as it's almost winter. As the name implies, they like cool weather. 40 maybe 40 to 60, 65 degrees, I suppose, is their ideal temperatures. So the problem with the winter grain mite, they're very small. They're in the soil. They spend the summer, early fall as eggs in the soil. The eggs start hatching in late September, October, November, once the weather starts to cool down. It's a little different every year. That's why it's kind of hard to pin down. But they start feeding as soon as they hatch out. That's why we always say it's one of the pests we try and talk people into planting a little later, to avoid planting your wheat a little later, because if your wheat's there and you have a good growing stand, the winter grain mites find it a good place to feast. They come out and they start feeding immediately once they hatch from the eggs. They start individually affecting cells of the plants. So as the eggs hatch, you get more and more. You're going to have more mites feeding on these plants. Generally, you know what? If we have good weather, good growing conditions, the mites don't bother the plants. But in this year so far, and looking down the road a few days, it doesn't look like we're going to have a lot of more moisture. So we're going to see more and more effects of winter grain mite feeding. They feed on the individual cells. They suck the juice out of the cell. If there's enough of them, they'll turn the plants kind of a silvery color. That's why a lot of guys, if we don't get any moisture, another 2 to 3 weeks, we'll start seeing a lot more silvery looking plants. at the tip of the plant, it will kind of turn a yellow or brown color. The rest of the plant will be silvery because they suck that chlorophyll, that juice out of the plant, and just leaves the silvery color, the tan colored plant there. So that's how you can notice. They generally are more destructive in continuous wheat. They'll feed on just about any grass, but remember they're mites. So like we've talked about with wintergreen wheat curl mites, they don't fly, they don't run, they don't hop. They're basically crawl from one plant to another, or the wind can move them around a little bit. So they don't move quickly from place to place, but they build up over a period of time. So in continuous wheat fields, we have more problems with them. Or along the edges of grass waterways or grass patches where they come out, if you just have had some soybeans or something and just planted wheat, they can come out. So you'll start seeing them move into the field from that grassy area. They can feed on corn and sorghum. So if you've had corn and sorghum in the field and you plant wheat, they can still be out there. But the thing is, you got to remember, wheat's growing now. Once it hits dormancy, they're not going to cause it a problem. Not much that I can remember in the past world is going to cause wheat a problem once it's in winter dormancy. Okay. That's the period of time when you can graze it or cut it or whatever you want to do, and it doesn't affect it. Once it's got the root system established. So what we're talking about is between now and when your field goes into dormancy. That's when all these pests can and do actively feed on that growing plant and can reduce the stand or make the plant less healthy for going into the overwintering period. Winter grain mites. The winter grain mite, to me, I really think they're neat looking. They're a dark colored body, green, dark blue, black, whatever. They have reddish legs and it's a red spot on their back. So they're very distinctive, but they're really small. You can see them with the unaided eye, but they're really small. They'll feed mainly at night or on cloudy days. Remember, they're called winter grain mice because they like cool weather. And the temperatures, if we're getting into the 70s, they'll stop feeding. They'll be down in the soil. They'll be under the leaves, or they'll be someplace in the cool part of the field, and then they'll actively feed at night. If you want to wait another week or two, if you start seeing some yellowing plants in your field, go out at night with a flashlight. If you do that and look for winter grain mites, a lot of times it's pretty shocking how many of these mites can be on these plants. Lots of times, when I first did this probably 20 years ago, the plants looked furry. I didn't see how anything could survive these little grain mites because they're feeding at night. You don't see them during the day. They're pretty shy. They'll crawl down the plant. They get in the soil to hide during the day. Or if it gets too cold, if it's much below 30 degrees, they don't feed either. So now is the ideal time for them to be feeding and for them to do any damage on your plant before it goes into dormancy for the winter and while it's still trying to grow. And now is the time you don't want them feeding on it because of the impact it might have on the stand. I mean, we've put out trials before. You can kill them with any of the registered insecticides that have winter grain mite on the label, but we don't really recommend that because soon, hopefully, we're going to get some moisture. The wheat's going to grow, and then it's going to go into dormancy, and then we don't have to worry about the pests until the next spring. And then they are the first thing we worry about in wheat in the spring. They'll start laying eggs. They'll reach their peak of the population in December. Again, remember, every year is different. It's all up to the temperature, but generally the populations peak in December. They lay eggs. Those eggs will lay dormant in the ground until the wheat breaks dormancy, late February, March, April. Every year is a little different. And then they'll start feeding. And again, that's the time you want to watch it, especially if we don't have good growing conditions, because again, they can start feeding on the plant. They interrupt the flow of the xylem and the phloem feeding on those cells, and you can have plant stands or reductions and all kinds of stuff. But between dormancy between the fall and the spring, which shouldn't be a problem. We're just not there yet.
If we warm up really fast in the spring when wheat is coming out of dormancy, does that help deter the winter curl mites from causing more damage?
It does. And you know what? If we get some big rains in the spring, well, if we get big thunderstorms, it washes them off the plant. I've seen it both ways. We've been out putting out plots, and in the spring is when you really kind of worry about it more so than in the fall because it's coming out of dormancy. If you don't get moisture, if you don't get adequate rain, that plant struggles, and there's a lot of things coming out, a lot of pests coming out of dormancy, feeding on it at the same time. So we have put out winter grain mite plots every time you get a big rain. And fortunately, in Kansas, in the last 40 years that I've been doing this, we always worry about it, but we've always gotten some rain in kind of a timely manner in the spring, and it washes the winter grain mites off just as we start thinking they might start doing some damage. So we've been fortunate, but they're always there, and they're always something to be of concern.
Thinking of winter grain mites, another mite, the wheat curl mite, and an update on that one.
Yes, in my opinion, we've talked a lot about wheat curl mites and wheat streak mosaic, the diseases that the wheat curl mite may carry. They don't all have it, but they can. And that's the thing we generally worry about more so than the mite feeding. There are, as we saw this summer and early in the spring, there are considerable populations of wheat curl mites around. Still, the best way to get rid of them is get rid of your volunteer, but that doesn't always, you can't always get rid of all the volunteer in a timely fashion. I have seen a couple of fields already that are showing indications of the mite feeding damage, and that is they curl the leaves. The mites will curl the leaves. I've not taken in any of the leaves to see if they actually have the virus yet, but I'm assuming they will. So if it's still not too late to get rid of the mites, if you have some volunteer or if you have a little bit of a field that you didn't quite get the volunteer taken care of because there's more moisture in the field and they're moved on to the wheat you've planted, now it might be a good time to try and get rid of that and maybe replant because the mites, they won't live much longer than a week or two without something to feed on, and by then your replanting hopefully will germinate. But there are some, you got to remember, there are some mites around. They're pretty tenacious. They can survive in other grasses. It's just the wheat that they affect because of the virus that they can transmit.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. Along with the normal team, they're joined by Dave Maples, who is the executive director of the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association.
So you talked about the dietitian, and it's more than just exposure or telling people about the industry and her role. One of the things you mentioned is the role of food as medicine. Tell us more about that. What's her discussion talking points on that front?
She's just really kind of opened the door for us. And one of the things that we've been able to do and we're working on here in Kentucky is our association started a ground beef program a couple of 6 years ago or so. So we're in the Kroger stores. We're in about 250 Kroger stores with a Kentucky Cattlemen's ground beef. But now what we've gotten that into is this food is medicine or food is health. And our Commissioner of Agriculture is there and really supporting us. So we're getting into these food boxes with a protein. I was with our dietitian in one of the meetings, and, most of the time we go to those food is health meetings, it's all about fruits and vegetables and what you eat and that. And I just took it as long as I could, and I stood up and I said, what about protein? And it was just like a light went off. And so what we've been doing is working with the Appalachian Regional Health folks, the hospital, and getting these food boxes and getting protein in them. So we've got our little 1 pound brick in working with Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and getting those boxes into the protein hamburger into those boxes so those patients can take them home with them. And so that's been pretty cool. And we're learning. It's very hard to do. Getting the logistics done is there, but man, they've been opened up. People want protein now. You can look and see what's going on with beef. We got a product that tastes good, and I think the health community is recognizing that.
Well, I think you're right. I've heard more about protein and what's the protein content of different food products in the last 5 years than I have in a long time.
So interesting conversation, and I'm glad to hear that that's moving that way, because so the dietitian that came to my class this year was told the class a few things that were new to me. Is that we typically think about 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight is what a person needs, but what she was saying is that they're changing some of those guidelines where active people, so people that exercise a lot, people that are active, they need to bump up that to almost 1.5 or 2 grams of protein per day for every kilogram of body weight. And then elderly people actually need to maintain that muscle mass and keep from losing muscle mass at 60 plus years old. They need to bump up the protein more than what we thought too. So they need to be up there at 1.5 grams or so. So we're learning some things from a human nutrition standpoint that we were probably actually underestimating the protein needs of several groups of people in our country.
There's been kind of a push, too, for the fat side of it, right? A reduction in vegetable-based fats and more towards an animal-based fat, which was perfect for me to hear, because I'll just cook with butter, lard, and tallow and bacon fat in my house, and I'll be happy to hear that.
Yeah. Well, and she mentioned, too, that from the USDA food guidelines is that they're changing some of that along that lines, that this fight against saturated fat is kind of dying down, that this is not, it's not the evil health concern that we used to think it was, and so they're not as big as cutting out as much saturated fat as much. The fight right now is sugars.
That was the Beef Cattle Institute's Philip Lancaster, Brad White, and Scott Fritz as they were joined by the Executive Director of the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, Dave Maples. If you would like to hear the full podcast episode, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, searching for Cattle Chat on your favorite podcast platform, or by going to ksubci.org. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.